Dear students, we have come to the last segment of this lesson, the last lesson. So we have already gone through the major portion of the chapter. In this one, I will just finish off the lesson. Okay, so just listen very attentively. Okay, now M. Hamel had been serving there in a school of Alsace for a span of 40 years. Now he wanted to preserve all the memories of the place. He was feeling really sad, he was feeling disconsolate, and he was feeling very passionate about the place. And he was observing everything as if he wanted to preserve everything in his memory, as if he wanted to treasure each and every moment he spent in that place. So only the desk and the benches had been worn smooth. The changes that he observed were that the desks and the benches had become smoother with the passage of time because of the constant use by the children, by the people. Then the walnut trees in the garden were taller. Walnut trees had grown taller, and the hop vine that he planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. And even the hop vine, a kind of climbing tree, a climber, which produces grapes, he had planted the tree himself, and it twined about, it coiled about, around the windows to the roof, and it reached the roof. Coiling around the windows, the hop vine reached the roof. So these were the changes which happened with the passage of time. With time, everything changes. So these were the changes that he observed, or those changes happened with time. How it must have broken his heart to live it all, poor man. So he must have been shattered. In fact, he was shattered. He was heartbroken. He was disheartened. He was demoralized because he had to leave everything there. So little Franz was feeling also very sad. Just looking at M. Hamel, he was feeling also very sad, and he could understand the grief that M. Hamel experienced at that point of time, before his parting, before he went away from the place. Mr. Hamel felt really disconsolate, really devastated. To hear his sister moving about in the room above. His sister, that is M. Hamel's sister, was moving in the room above their classroom. There was a room where M. Hamel used to live, M. Hamel used to reside, M. Hamel used to stay, and his sister was just moving about in the room, packing their trunks. They were getting ready. His sister, Mr. Hamel's sister, was packing the trunks, packing the trunks, their luggage, their goods, their articles, their belongings. They had to pack up everything before leaving. So his sister was just making all the arrangements, for they must leave the country next day, because they had to leave the country. They had to leave Alsace the very next day, because a new teacher, a German teacher, would arrive on the next day. So it was a very, very grievous situation. It was a very sad situation for Mr. Hamel, for little Franz, for everybody who was present there. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. But still, Mr. Hamel had the courage, had the guts to listen, to hear everything, to hear every lesson to the very last. In fact, even on the last day of his teaching career there in Alsace, he kept on. He continued to listen. He continued to hear with passion. He continued to hear every lesson with passion. After the writing, we had a lesson in history. After writing was done, little Franz and his classmates, they had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted their ba, be, bi, bo, bu. So, and the babies, the little ones or the little children, they chanted. Chanted means uttered, produced, pronounced. Okay, so they chanted syllables, different syllables. Down there at the back of the room, and at the back of the room, the village people were sitting there. Among them, the old Hauser had put on his spectacles. The old Hauser was there. Okay, the old Hauser. Do you remember the old Hauser? He was there actually. He had already put on his big spectacles and holding his primer and holding his elementary book, the primer in both hands. He was holding the primer in both hands, spelled the letters with them, and he spelled the letters with them, with those little ones, with those small children who were chanting, who were uttering, or who were pronouncing those syllables. He was, the old Hauser was also trying to do the same, simply because he neglected his studies when he was a student, he was a child. Now he was feeling remorse, or he was feeling repentant for neglecting his studies, for not learning his language properly. Now he could understand what he was going to lose, because from the very next day, only German language would be taught there. And he would never have the opportunity to learn his mother tongue, the French language. Okay? You could see that he too was crying. The old Hauser was crying. His voice trembled with emotion. His voice trembled with emotion. Tremble is to shake. Okay? His voice was shaken with emotion. He was feeling so emotional that his voice trembled. He could not even pronounce those words. He could not pronounce the syllables or the words properly because he was choking with emotion. He was really feeling emotional and could not produce or could not pronounce the letters or the syllables properly. And it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. And it was really a very complicated situation, very tricky situation. Little Franz and his classmates did not know how to react to that situation. They felt it was so funny to watch this old Hauser, okay, attempting to pronounce the letters, pronounce the syllables, and when he was crying, he was feeling emotional. And that sight and that incident of the Hauser trying to produce those letters and pronounce those letters and syllables, it produced mixed emotions among these classmates of little Franz and himself as well. And they didn't know, they were confused whether they should laugh or they should cry. Okay? So they could not decide whether they should laugh or they should cry. The situation was so funny. An old man trying to pronounce letters, pronounce syllables, and getting mixed up, choking with emotion. Okay, it was something which is funny or amusing. But at the same time, the situation was so serious, so solemn, that they were going to lose their mother tongue, French. They felt as if they could not help weeping. Okay, they felt as if they would cry. So it was a very complex situation for them. How well I remember it, the last lesson. Then little Franz says, How well I remember the last lesson. How well I remember it, the last lesson. I can remember it really very well. All at once the church clock struck 12, then the Angelus. At the same moment, the trumpet of the Prussians returning from the drill sounded under our windows. So, all at once after that, the church clock struck 12, then there was 12 o'clock. Then after that, the Angelus. Then the sound of the trumpets of the Prussian soldiers returning from their drill, returning from their exercise. So little Franz and his classmates could hear all these sounds, the church clock, then the Angelus, then the trumpets of the Prussians returning from the exercise. So all these things were audible to little Franz and his classmates, sounded under our windows. So they could hear all these sounds under the windows of their classroom. M. Hamel stood up, very pale. M. Hamel then stood up, that it was time. Very pale, he looked very pale. Pale means colorless. He looked very colorless. He looked sober in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. This is a delightful sentence. Little Franz never saw Mr. Hamel look so tall. On that day, Mr. Hamel, M. Hamel, looked the tallest. Okay, looked to be the tallest man there. He never saw Mr. Hamel look so tall because his image as a person, okay, his image as a person, as a human being, as a teacher, was the greatest. Okay, it reached the highest position, it reached the summit. So his image grew as a person tremendously. On that day, the respect, little Franz's respect for Mr. Hamel, for his teacher, grew tremendously. And Mr. Hamel appeared to be the tallest that he ever saw. Okay, he had never found Mr. Hamel to be that tall, to be so tall, because he never concentrated on his studies seriously. But on that day, he concentrated on his studies seriously, and at the same time, Mr. Hamel managed to get the respect from little Franz. Okay, so he looked to be so tall. Then Mr. Hamel said, "My friends," said he, I. But something choked him. He could not go on. Mr. Hamel just tried to speak something, tried to just tell them something. But when he started to speak, he stammered. He was choking with emotion. Something choked him. Something just prevented him from speaking. Obviously, he was feeling really very emotional. He could not go on. He could not carry on. He could not speak. Then he turned to the blackboard. Then he turned to the blackboard rather, took a piece of chalk, then took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, and just using all his might, all his power. Might means power. Students, might means power or energy. Then using all his energy, using all his power, he wrote as large as he could. Then he wrote as large as he could manage. Vive la France. Then he wrote on the blackboard, Vive la France. Long live Vive la France means long live France. Okay. He just prayed for the longevity of France, longevity of the French language. He was a well-wisher of his mother tongue, his French language, and the country, France. So he was a patriotic man. He was feeling really patriotic. And he prayed for his country, prayed for his language. Then he stopped after that and leaned his head against the wall. Then he leaned his head against the wall. He was feeling so emotional, so heartbroken. It was a tremendous amount of grief completely seized him. he was completely choked by tremendous amount of grief, sadness, sorrow. And without a word, he could not even speak. He was choking with emotion. He couldn't even speak. He made a gesture to us with his hand. He couldn't speak. Evidently, he couldn't speak because of the tremendous amount of emotion. So he simply put a gesture to us. He made a gesture to us with his hand. He's just using his hand. He's just signaled. Gesture means a kind of signal or a kind of hint, a kind of indication that you make. Okay, by using your organs like your hand or your eyes. Okay, then he made a gesture to us with his hand. Using his hand, he made a gesture. School is dismissed. You may go. Then the gesture meant that the school is dismissed. You can leave. You may go now. He couldn't speak because he was obviously devastated with grief. He was shattered with grief. He was heartbroken. He simply just put his hand and gestured to everyone that the school is dismissed. All of you can go. Okay, this is the end of the lesson. I hope everyone has understood my explanations. Okay, until the next time, goodbye. Thank you.